I suspect that many of you who have conscientiously studied up on the war in Vietnam and just finally begun to get that war in perspective must be appalled at the thought of having to start all over again with another war. And all I can say to encourage you is at the present moment there aren't very many experts on the war in Laos. I know very little about it myself, but having written something about it in Ramparts in January, apparently that puts me up in the forefront of the people who've been seeing this, looking at the war. And of course, that's one of the main reasons why the war is being fought in Laos at this time. That Nixon's interest in getting the war on the back pages of the newspapers, in toning down protest, has turned to Laos for two reasons. First of all, that primarily America is going to fight an air war there instead of a ground war, which is fewer casualties on our side, although it causes horrible casualties on the other side. And secondly, Laos is an area where the news correspondents cannot roam with the same freedom that they have known recently in Vietnam. So it really is the same war. Vietnamization in Vietnam means stepping up the war in Laos, and I think if that's a fairly cynical way of assessing what Nixon wants, I think the best proof of it is the fact that last October, at the time when Nixon was talking about Vietnamization, Air America, which is the so-called CIA Air Force or Air Support paramilitary force which operates in Laos and elsewhere, was sending out letters to retired U.S. Air Force pilots and saying, we are planning to step up our operations in Laos. This, incidentally, was at a time when ostensibly things looked very well for the Americans in Laos. There was no particular crisis. The Americans had just recaptured the Plaine des Jars. All looked well, and yet it was clear that big things in Laos were intended at that time, and in fact these letters were going out to people who had retired from the Air Force way back in 1966, had been processed for further action and had applied to Air America, but they had not heard from Air America from 1966 right up until late 1969. So I think there is no doubt about the intention to keep the war going in Laos at the same time as it is being cooled down in Vietnam. But I'd like to talk a bit about the enormity of what is happening now, and then to show the kind of permanent pattern in what's been happening. And this means going back into what is unfortunately a very involved history in Laos, and I'll try to pick out just those features which have a bearing on the recent escalation, because it's my thesis that what we have seen recently in Laos, the crisis that we have at the present moment, is the same kind of crisis which happened repeatedly in Vietnam, and which France and I talked about in our book, The Politics of Escalation, that the war has been built up recently in Laos as a result of the real danger that Suvarnabhumi might have been able to achieve some kind of peace in that country. Well, the permanent pattern I am talking about is one which goes back to the 1954 Geneva Agreements. We have to go back to those again, I'm sorry. And of course, the American position nominally with respect to Laos was different than it was with respect to Vietnam. With respect to Vietnam, it did not initial the agreements, did not accept the idea of reunification, but Laos, of course, was reunified, and a government was set up, and a question was postponed to which the Americans took no evident opposition, the question of integrating the Pathet Lao, or left-wing army, into the regular army of the Laotian government, at which time the question of neutralization of Laos would have been substantially completed. There was nothing that indicated that America would object to the neutralization of Laos. It should have seemed like a desirable goal. Suvarnabhumi was premier in November 1957, 13 years ago, and he made the mistake of achieving an agreement with his half-brother, Prince Suvarnabhumi, who was the leader of the Pathet Lao forces in Laos. Laotian politics then were largely a princely matter, and the factions on both sides were represented by the same different branches of the same royal house. The so-called Vientiane agreements were signed in November 57, which provided for the peaceful reintegration of the Pathet Lao army into the Royal Laotian forces. And this created some kind of consternation in Washington because it entailed Souphanouvong coming into the cabinet, and there was, typical of Laotian politics, actually a brief period where American aid in Laos was being administered by a Pathet Lao minister. But America had no intention of going along with that, and it's now recorded in quasi-establishment sources like Schlesinger and so on, that when Souphanouvong was forced out of power in July 23rd, 1968, it was largely because of American fear at a kind of neutralization which would actually involve the other side participating in power, and that the actual mechanics of it were also handled by the Americans. First, the Americans withheld aid to Souphanouvong, and then a right-wing faction in the parliament, which was largely organized by the CIA. The CIA had flown a Colonel Pumi Nosavan back from Paris so that he could take part in these operations. This right-wing CIA-backed faction succeeded in passing a vote of no confidence, and Souphanouvong was out of power. Well, in the next the next months into 1959 are a period of ascendancy of the right with the support of American military aid, which was fantastic in those days in terms of the entire total Laotian gross national product. We pumped something like $300 million into that country in 5 years, which worked out to something like half the average annual wage per Laotian for that period. And the result was that the economy of the country was wrecked. I don't think this, of course, wasn't intended. It was just the kind of blind application of the determination on Washington's part to militarize a nation which had no militarist instincts. Laos ended up having one of the highest ratios of police officers to the population in the world, although it also at the same time had one of the lowest crime rates. And somebody pointed this out in a Senate or a House investigating committee, which found this rather surprising, and it was explained that, of course, the presence of police officers in Laos didn't have anything to do with the incidence of crime in that country. Well, in 1959, as a result of all this, the supposed reintegration of the Pathet Lao army, which was into the forces, did not take place. It was supposed to take place, of course, into the forces of a neutralist government, but now there was no longer a neutralist government, and the Pathet Lao faction had been forced out of the coalition, so the Pathet Lao army, quite reasonably, I think, under those circumstances, declined to be integrated into the Royal Laotian Army. They slipped away. They were surrounded by the Royal Laotian Army, but they managed to get away, and that was the beginning of the great Laotian crisis of 1959, which unfortunately is very important to us still today, because that is the beginning of the first stage of the reopening of the Indochina War. The Indochina War, in terms of military operations, really began in Laos rather than in Vietnam, and in a very real sense, the American commitment to Vietnam in 1961 grew, as we shall see, out of the American intervention in Laos in 1959. Now, I don't want to spend too long on this because it is history, and I did write about it in Ramparts in January, but essentially the American press was swamped, deluged with reports out of Laos that there was a huge rebellion in that country, and that there was not only a rebellion but an invasion. And I would just give one just cite one report out of many. The Washington Post, which was regarded at that time as a liberal and responsible newspaper, reported that there were 3,500 rebel troops, including large numbers of North Vietnamese, who had captured 80 villages in the northeast sector of Laos. That was a typical story. There were others that were more extreme that said as many as 4 or 5 divisions of North Vietnamese soldiers had come down into Laos. There was also talk of Chinese, that is to say, troops of People's China in Laos. And a good deal of the sort of image in this country today of Chinese expansionism, North Vietnamese expansionism, has been based on the image which was created at that time of these 3,000 or 4,000 troops pouring into Laos and capturing 80 villages. Well, that period has been written about in history. As it turns out, it wasn't 80 villages that had been captured. It was 3 villages from which the occupying garrisons had withdrawn. 2 of them had been briefly shelled for a matter of hours, and the 3rd garrison simply got scared. As to the large numbers of the 4 or 5 divisions of North Vietnamese, the UN sent an investigating committee, and they said, let us see your prisoners. You say you have some North Vietnamese prisoners. Well, the Laotian government for weeks refused to let them see the prisoners, and then it turned out they only had 7 North Vietnamese prisoners. And then it turned out that in fact, the 7 North Vietnamese prisoners were not prisoners in the ordinary sense. They were people who, in fact, had left North Vietnam voluntarily in order to join our side. So that brought it down to 0 prisoners, and that may seem a rather simple way of correcting the image that was created at that time, but I think really that there was nothing in it so far as a North Vietnamese attack is concerned, and that's very important to remember because so much is being said about 50,000 North Vietnamese in Laos today, and I'm sure at this stage there are some North Vietnamese, but I'm not at all convinced that we're dealing with anything like that number of people. Well, I'll rush ahead because I want to talk mostly about what's happening today, but in 1960, as some of you may know, Suvarnabhumi was restored to power by what seems to have been one of the few genuine political movements in Laos in this whole period, the uprising of Kong Le, who was a relatively young paratrooper and who was able to restore the Suvarnabhumi. The United States recognized Suvarnabhumi, said that it would support Suvarnabhumi, but meanwhile, and this is very characteristic, at the same time that the State Department was telling Suvarnabhumi that we would support him, high Defense Department officials and high officials from CINCPAC, the Commander-in-Chief in Honolulu, the U.S. Commander-in-Chief, went to Phumi Nosavan, the CIA man, and said, look, we will support you if you overthrow Suvarnabhumi. And we did support them, and the proof that we supported Phumi Nosavan in a rebellion is that Air America started flying supplies in at a great rate to Phumi Nosavan's rebel capital in the south of Laos, at the same time that the Americans cut off military aid to the officially recognized government of Suvarnabhumi in the north of Laos. The result of that was that the Russians also started flying in troops, not troops at all. They started flying in supplies to the official government in Vientiane to match what the Americans were doing to the rebel government down in Savannakhet. And this is when Eisenhower went out of government, and it looked as if we might have a great power confrontation over what was happening in Laos. It is clear, there is no ambiguity about it, the initiative for great power intervention in that year was taken by the Americans, and that the Russians were doing was responding in kind, and they were very careful to keep it that way. Finally, Kennedy came in and said, we can't win. It wasn't that he really was, I think, a peace lover in Laos so much as he asked his Joint Chiefs, can you win in Laos? And it turned out they couldn't. So he said, all right, I respect him for this. He said, then we will try to make peace. And they did. It was in May the 3rd, 1961, that a ceasefire was agreed to in Laos, and it was on May the 4th, 1961, one day later, that Dean Rusk announced that the situation was very grave in Vietnam and that we were going to increase American aid there immediately. A day after that, it was announced that Lyndon Johnson would fly out to Vietnam and find out what Ngo Dinh Diem needed, and so the spotlight transferred from Laos to Vietnam. And in 1962, when finally the Geneva Agreements on Laos were signed, again the scene shifted not only to Vietnam, but also at that time to Thailand, because that is the beginning of our permanent presence and offensive presence in Thailand. There is, if you look at these countries together, there is a kind of continuity, a kind of steady build-up, which is more important than the apparent kinds of détente and peace which were reached, for example, in 1962. 1964, Suvarnabhuma made another mistake. He again made contact with the three factions, because there was now a neutralist faction in Laos, as well as a right and a left faction, and he was making progress, or at least he claimed to be making progress, in restoring a truly neutralist government in Laos. Again, he was turned out of power back in 1964. And this time it's a bit different from 1958, because nominally he was restored to power almost immediately in April 1964, but in fact the basis for a neutralist coalition had been destroyed, because the neutralist army had been subordinated to the right-wing army, and that is how the Pathet Lao managed to take the Plaine des Jarres in the first place, because the Plaine des Jarres had been occupied by the neutralist forces of Kong Le. And when the neutralist forces were subordinated to the right-wing army, many of the neutralists who were actually occupying the plain would not go along with this and preferred at that moment to side with the Pathet Lao rather than with the pro-American forces in Vientiane. And that is attested to by a essentially pro-American student of Laos, Dennis Warner. So you see, twice Suvarnabhuma had been making progress towards neutralization of Laos, and twice he had been frustrated by the people who wanted war or who wanted confrontation in that country. Now, I'd go straight now to 1968, because the same 1969 rather, because the same thing seems to have happened last year and seems to be what what is happening at the present moment. Last May, on May the 16th, 1969, the New York Times reported that Suvarnabhuma had just met with the North Vietnamese ambassador in Laos for the first time in 4 years, which is to say, for the first time since way back in the 64-65 period, and that these talks seem particularly important because Moscow had sent a high-level foreign ministry official, and it was speculated that perhaps the Soviet Union was trying to help bring about some kind of détente rapprochement in Laos. And Suvarnabhuma made the surprising announcement that he thought that perhaps the war in Laos could be settled. This was after he'd met the ambassador. He announced that there are grounds for thinking that perhaps the war in Laos can be settled before the war in Vietnam, despite the fact that they are obviously linked, and so on. And the press speculated that the North Vietnamese had offered to withdraw what troops they have, or a large number of what troops they had in Laos, if Suvarna could persuade the Americans to stop the bombing in Laos. And the Times seemed rather hopeful about this, and the story 2 days later was also rather hopeful, because it said there don't seem to be any Pathet Lao attacks in the country. The only military initiatives being taken right now are being taken by our side. Well, it was only about a week after that it was announced that a rather extraordinary military initiative on our part had succeeded in capturing the capital of the Plaine des Jars, Quang, and 2 days after that, capturing a town called Ban Ban, which is the last big town on the highway going into North Vietnam. In other words, we had pushed right through to the North Vietnamese border. So clearly, this was not the sort of thing which was going to make it easy for the talks of Le Van Hien and Savannah Puma to be fruitful. In June, the other side showed that they were not in an inferior position in that area. They struck back in the opposite direction and were able to capture an important base on the west side, that is to say the American side of the Plaine des Jars. And this capture was very embarrassing because it turned out that this base, Mong Sui, had been chiefly populated with American and Thai troops. No one is quite clear how many Americans, how many Thais, speculated as many as 5,000 Thai troops now dressed in Laotian uniforms in Laos. But it was clear that they were there. This was embarrassing to the Americans. The Americans retaliated again and reoccupied the Plaine des Jars in September, but it has been said that the main purpose in this reoccupation was to evacuate the population of the Plaine des Jars and turn it into one of these free fire zones that France was referring to, where you can bomb anything that moves. And I should just remind you that the number of air missions that are admitted to in Laos, which were supposed to be in the order, no, sorry, this has not been admitted, but the speculations about the number of missions, air missions in Laos, have risen from about 1,000 a month in the beginning of 1969 to about 5,000 a month last fall. And on January 1st of this year, the Far Eastern Economic Review speculated there may be as many as 20,000 missions a month in Laos, which far exceeds the worst bombing of that terrible, hitherto unprecedented bombing of North Vietnam. So we recaptured the Plaine des Jars, and we've seen just recently in the last weeks that the North Vietnamese have taken it yet again. There is nothing new about this. They've retaken the Plaine des Jars, they've retaken Mong Sui. The situation is back to what it was last June, and essentially to what it has been in that area ever since 1964. So that in itself is not the crisis. The escalation has clearly come from our side, and it is clearly very alarming. And let me just point out one thing about it that the press tends to overlook. A lot of people think that the interest that we have in the Plaine des Jars must relate to our interest in the Ho Chi Minh Trail going down through Laos into South Vietnam, and that this comes from the understandable motive of wanting to interdict North Vietnamese supply lines and, as the government likes to put it, save the lives of our GIs in South Vietnam. But that is nonsense if you look at a map of Laos, because Laos is like a huge frying pan, and with the pan end, the square pan end up at the north, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail goes down one side of the handle, and it starts about a third of the way down the handle and goes out down to the end of the handle, whereas the Plaine des Jars is up in the pan. It is a long way from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We are much closer to the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Mekong Valley, down at Savannah and places, than we are at in the Plaine des Jars itself. This is a separate operation, and the intensity with which we are fighting it is, I think, not understandable in terms of the very obvious military interest that the Americans have in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, as to what our interest then can be in fighting this war, one can only speculate. But my own personal opinion is that if you look at everything that has happened in that area since about 1957, that you see a pattern of apparent escalations followed by apparent de-escalations whereas underneath it there is a real continuing pattern of an increasing U.S. military presence. Now, it's a bit different now. We obviously are bringing troops out of Vietnam, but I think every one of those troops that is being brought out of Vietnam is being compensated for by an increase in air power in that area, and that America wants very much to make that air power credible, and the only way it can make that air power credible is to use it. This is the kind of hard talk which generals use, and that is the logic which I think is pertaining in this area. As to why we should have such a desperate interest in proving that we can use air power in Laos, which should be perfectly obvious considering the capacities of the American government and the tiny and essentially peaceful characteristics of the Laotian people themselves. All I can say is a famous quote on the left, which some of you have heard before, but I think it's worth remembering at this time. This is from the Vice President for Far Eastern Operations of the Chase Manhattan Bank speaking in the summer of 1965, which was right at the beginning of the Americanization of the war under Lyndon Johnson. And he said, "In the past, foreign investors have been somewhat wary of the overall political prospect for the Southeast Asia region. I must say, though, that the U.S. actions in Vietnam this year, which have demonstrated that the U.S. will continue to give effective protection to the free nations of the region, have considerably reassured both Asian and Western investors. In fact, I see some reason for hope that the same sort of economic growth may take place in the free economies of Asia that took place in Europe after the Truman Doctrine and after NATO provided a protective shield. The same thing also took place," this is still the Chase Manhattan Bank, ma'am, "the same thing also took place in Japan after the U.S. intervention in Korea removed investor doubts." Now, you see, this Vice President of Chase Manhattan has a slightly larger vision and perspective than I have been using, because I've only been talking about Indochina, but he is talking about the whole of Southeast Asia. Doubtless he has in mind countries like Malaysia and perhaps particularly Indonesia as well. And it's a very striking feature that American investment in that area, which was rather dilatory and rather small up until 1959, reached a sort of takeoff point in 1959, which is rather paradoxical when you think about it, because that is the year that the American press was filled with these scare headlines about North Vietnamese and Chinese massing to swoop down on the area. I don't want to belabor this point, but an issue of Business Week in January of this year quotes some kind of economic committee complaining about the investment, the rate of profit on investment in Latin America being only 12%, whereas the rate of return on profits in the Far East is 34%. If you think about that for a moment, it means that if you invest in Southeast Asia, it means you have a total return on your investment in 3 years, and everything after that is gravy. And the rate of investment in the Far East has been steadily rising. About 40% of it is in petroleum, which is, as you know, one of the best paying returns on investment. And so without trying to fully to understand what is happening in the Far East, I would simply say that without any doubt there is a very real economic stake for certain kinds of Americans in our continuing to do what we do there. For the rest of us, of course, it is quite the opposite. And for the Laotians themselves, it is an unmitigated disaster what has happened to their country. And it is terrible to go back now and read the glib kind of confident remarks of CIA men as quoted in the U.S. press 10 years ago when they were asked what you're trying to do. Say, "We are trying to provoke a confrontation in this country." That is what a CIA man told a Time reporter 10 years ago. Well, they succeeded. And now today, there are something like a quarter of the Laotian population is in resettlement camps. We have this, as I say, unprecedented kind of bombing going on in a country which never hurt anybody. And as to what we do about it, I don't know, but I will, at this point, hand the microphone over.